Hey, it's Beth. I'm glad to see you again today. I just wanted to take a minute to remind you a little bit about our story from yesterday. Do you remember that I introduced you to a woman named Desta, whose belly was growing and who had an active little son, and who spent her days making Ethiopian bread called injera? And I also introduced you to a family here in Indiana, a family who had been asking the Lord and each other, how is it that He might be able to use them somewhere in Africa? There was another mother in Ethiopia I wanted to tell you about. Her name was Adina. And like many, many mothers in Ethiopia, she carried her baby tied to her back from where she would sleep at night to where she would work on a corner of a street selling goods and making enough money in order to provide for her and her son. But she was noticing in the most recent months that that bundle was getting heavier and heavier, and her body was getting weaker and weaker, and although she didn't know exactly what she was sick of, she knew that something was terribly wrong. During that walk back and forth from the corner of the street back to her shelter, she would pass every day a church where the people inside would take care of children whose moms and dads couldn't any longer. A place we might recognize as an orphanage, but Adina just saw it as a refuge, as a possible answer to the questions that were going around in her mind. What happens if I get sicker and weaker? What happens if this baby, who she named Ebenezer, gets heavier and heavier? What happens if nobody buys what I'm trying to sell? What happens if one day I just can't get up? It was during one of those days passing by that church that she walks in and begins to ask some questions. And then she carefully and tearfully and painfully untied that baby bundle from her back and handed it over to the women in that church. She walked away that day knowing that God had provided for her an answer to the questions she had been asking, but knowing that her heart would never be the same again. We know that Adina died later that week from the disease that had racked her body, and that she, the best that she could, cared for her child for as long as she possibly could have. Meanwhile, back in the church, as the women at the children's home opened up that bundle and looked at who it was that was inside, what they found was a very small and sick baby that desperately needed medical care. They knew the next step was figuring out exactly what this little Ebenezer had wrong with his body and wondering who it was that could take care of him.
Who will be the new child for the family in Indiana? Will God provide a home for Ebenezer? Come back next time to find out.